Now today, this afternoon, I'm delighted to be here in the private home of Claire Keating, Slíonamara in Mungret, and where we are is actually the closest housing development to the Irish cement site plant. And I'm also delighted to be joined by LAP, that's Limerick Against Pollution members, Derek and Angus. It's great to be here, and thank you for having both myself and Dennis Mulholland. Now, to a lot of people around the country, the free, safe living is exceptionally important, whether you're in a town, a city, or hinterland. And in the recent past, very controversial decisions have been made with regard to the operation of Irish cement, which in turn, democratically, was appealed to An Bord Pleanála for direction. And unfortunately for everybody concerned, the directions of An Bord Pleanála upheld the decision by the Limerick City and County Council. Now we're here today to talk specifically about its terms and conditions, and also, very importantly, about the ramifications for the people who are living closest to the Irish cement plant. Claire, I'm going to start with you first there, as this is the beautiful housing development, can I say, of Slíonamara, here in the county of Limerick in Mungret. But what are the major concerns over the recent decisions of the Limerick City County Council and then on to An Bord Pleanála?
Okay, well, I suppose we put a very strong case forward to An Bord Pleanála at the hearing last August, and we felt that we did enough really to encourage the An Bord Pleanála to reverse the decision that the Limerick City and County Council had really rushed through, we feel, which the day before our public protest March of last year. So we were extremely disappointed when we got the news last Friday the 13th of April to say that unfortunately we had lost our appeal, and therefore the decision stands. I suppose for us the major concern is the emissions from burning all of these wastes. You have everything from tyres, plastics, red mud, fly ash, bottom ash. There's a very extensive list available on our social media page if anybody wants to have a look at it in more detail. But there is definitely there's serious concerns here. We're a new housing development consisting mainly of young couples, young families, and we bought these houses as our forever homes basically, and we with no anticipation of ever having to sell and move on, but now we're all in fear as to what these emissions are going to bring to our housing area and what kind of future is in line for us. So it's very worrying, to be honest with you, John.
You see, when an application is made by the company here, Irish Cement, or their holding company, Derek, the whole emphasis of a decision has to be based, in my layman's language, on environmental impact. Now, what I'm looking at is that, was there any reference to an environmental impact study? Because as Claire has stated, I mean, the list is frightening of what will be burned over there. It will be tyres, which will give off a toxic fume anyway, red mud, where we know is lying in Ahinish, is that right? That's indeed, right, as well, and all of that. So whatever way the wind blows, east or west, it's going to carry that toxic fume into people's homes, and if that is airborne, we will be breathing it ourselves. Am I right in that, Derek?
Absolutely. John, there were impact assessments done.
Right.
And the onus then falls on the Limerick City and County Council to review, assess and challenge.
Right.
Our first concern was that we didn't see that due diligence being done. We continued to ask questions and found that answers weren't forthcoming. And it seemed as if the decision was pretty much a fait accompli by the council. They simply wanted the paper to go through. We resisted coming to that conclusion, but ultimately when we got to An Bord Pleanála and we asked them questions about the 114 categories of waste, we found that the council hadn't even decoded the encoded information that CRH had provided. They also raised the issue with the HSE in terms of identifying tyres as a potential fuel. It was the only one on the list that they included. The HSE in turn simply took that list, sent a one-pager essentially to Health England, to whom they had delegated the risk assessment, and Health England came back with a one-page response. That was the extent of the public health risk assessment that was done on this. So for them to acknowledge that they'd assessed the risk when in actual fact they hadn't even read the list of elements tells you all you need to know about how much due diligence was done.
So in fact, actually, this is mind-boggling. With the application that was made to Limerick City and County Council, the first port of call, 140 materials were listed for burning.
114, John.
114. And on top of that, only maybe one or two were looked at by the council.
Only one or two were looked at.
And the environmental impact.
You're bang on when you say mind-boggling, but you wouldn't simply be quoting me when you say mind-boggling, because we're essentially quoting the council's barrister. So in his summing up, the council's barrister acknowledged that there were shortcomings in their due diligence. He seems to have implied that that was because insufficient information was provided to the council. Yet we got the information from the council's website. So clearly the information hadn't been read by the council. The barrister at the time encouraged An Bord Pleanála to take this list very seriously. And to the extent that the planning consent came back with conditions, one of which was to delete 14 of the most egregious toxins from the list, we have some sense of satisfaction that we accomplished something. But it's 14 of the 114, and the remaining toxins remain. But what's also interesting is the argument that's been made from the outset by CRH was that they needed alternative source of fuels. Yet we estimate probably 25, maybe 30 of the items on this list are not even combustible. So they clearly aren't fuel. They're essentially raw materials that will go into the cement, but raw materials that also represent a lucrative revenue stream for CRH.
Right.
So if you take, for example, in Foynes, we have 140 approximately acres of toxic red mud.
Correct.
That Rusal are not in a position to dispose of. There's no market for it anywhere. However, getting rid of this somehow is important strategically to Rusal.
So they're going to ship that in.
They're going to ship that
to
in,
Mungret.
to Mungret, and put it into the kiln and burn it.
And do we know then that if this red mud is toxic, is it, you know, how is it going to be?
They haven't categorized it as toxic, but anecdotal evidence as well as studies from elsewhere, including China and Hungary, I believe,
Correct.
have shown that it's arsenic laden, that when it gets into the ecosystem it's extremely toxic. It will absolutely kill any river,
fish.
any ecosystem
Lord.
that it gets into.
And that hasn't been touched on.
It hasn't been touched on because essentially Rusal know that this is a ticking bomb. That's why they continue to, for example, obtain planning permission to blast,
Yeah, yes.
but also to continue to build up the bund that's around it. It's probably about 6 meters tall right
40
now.
million tonnes.
And they continue to make it higher and higher to accommodate more and more of this red mud. But essentially, we as a society are not just accumulating this toxic stuff, but we're accumulating it adjacent to the estuary. So if, for whatever reason, it gets into the estuary, and we're just talking about, 15, 20 meters from the edge of the water, then the current risk to the ecosystem is enormous. We're now about to ratchet that risk up by trucking this substance from Ohanish,
Right.
putting it into the kiln here. Now, there are scientific arguments that we've heard from various people, in UL as an example, people who happen to be funded by CRH, who are saying they believe this to be risk-free. Yet we've never seen data to say that some analysis has been done to confirm what, if any, risks might exist.
But didn't they say, Angus, at the time as well, that fluoride going into water was risk-free? And now it seems that fluoride, now through further analysis 20 years on, is now causing major question marks as well. First of all, thank you, Angus, and thank you for Claire and Derek for that. Angus, you're very welcome as well. But I'll come back to that in a minute about fluoride. But Angus, from your point of view now, what are your major concerns?
Well, there are concerns on every level. As Derek's pointed out, there are very serious health risks to the, not just immediate environment, but to the region as a whole, to the estuary, to the environmental risks to the estuary. There are reputational risks. Limerick's at a point when it really sees its future over the next decade or two as being one of expanding and attracting direct foreign investment and becoming a kind of hub for a smart business. And one really has to wonder if it's a sensible thing to do to actually start burning huge amounts of industrial waste on top of an expanding city. And what's even more concerning is that much of that expansion is going to happen in the very shadow of the cement works, and therefore there's a lot of quite bad decision making happening there. So I think those three levels of risk are of immediate concern. I suppose I have been also perturbed by the lack of community engagement from the beginning. And I live within 2 miles of the cement works, but it was really only just reading in the local papers after about a year of the plan being essentially in the public domain that I began to really question what was happening, and then going to a meeting and slowly beginning to see that the concern that I felt was one shared by many other people in the community. But nothing had really been explained, and I think Irish Cement really failed in any transparent way to explain to the community what was happening. And this, over the subsequent months during 2016 and last year 2017, this led to a lot of quite really deeply concerning stories erupting across the community, some which were perhaps slightly exaggerated, but many which just reflected a deep sense of anxiety and worry amongst the people. And then when we began to unpick a bit more, we began to realise that actually Irish Cement had a very deep and quite dark history going back. They established themselves in Mungret in 1938, and really for the first 40 odd years they didn't really filter any of the process, and so there are older members of the Limerick community who remember when the whole of Mungret was covered in cement dust. We heard stories as to how windows in the hospital were closed when the wind was blowing in a particular direction, because the dust used to blow in from the cement works and would obviously hamper people in their recovery. And then it also began to emerge just how bad the level of pulmonary disease was in Limerick.
I was just going to come to that, yes.
And the HSE in recent years have started to publish annual county-by-county statistics on different aspects of public health. And we began to be deeply concerned by the fact that Limerick has almost 20,000 people suffering from asthma who are medicated for asthma. That's 1 in 5 people.
On that as well, I just said it in my post prior to this interview with yourselves, but I think it's now emerging. Now, some doctors will support it, some doctors will not support it, but we're now beginning to see emerging a cluster of tumours, pulmonary diseases, and also cancers. Now, if there's a cluster, it means it's a given area. That can be 2 miles, 5 miles, 20 miles in diameter, or even 30 miles in diameter. But it is happening. It is happening. And you hit on a very good point there, Angus, as well, about the pulmonary diseases that are going up and up and up. So it's not coming out of thin air. Well, thin air, I mean, it is coming out of airborne. But What do you think on that? I mean, surely be to God, An Bord Pleanála must have seen this. They must know this.
Well, one of the more disappointing meetings that we had, John, was with the HSE. So we spoke to the local public health directorate, and our questions to them were, you know, as part of this campaign, we've had anecdotal evidence of clusters in Mungret, in True,
yes,
in Clorina. And we mentioned Rusal earlier. Obviously there's talk of clusters around Askeaton and around Foynes.
The evidence is there.
Our question to them was, if we have data for the county and we have data for the city, how come we don't have more granularity to that? And their response was that they had been working in conjunction with An Post to develop a postcode system that would allow them to get better accuracy. And because their recommendations weren't taken, Aircode doesn't allow them to achieve the granularity, therefore they don't have any. And we countered and said, well, Facebook can tell me accurate to the nearest 2 or 3 houses,
yes,
what TV programs I like, or what my favorite
correct,
food is. You have information from addresses, from obituaries, from funeral undertakers. Are you telling us that historically you can't narrow down even to a townland where the clusters might be? And we were told no. Now, in terms of specific clusters, Angus has had personal contact with a cluster in True, and my own family cluster. So of 9 in my dad's family, 6 cancers, and they were raised adjacent to the quarry. So it's not rare, but the data is not gathered. And despite the fact that we have a directorate within the HSE, the analysis, let alone the preemptive work on the existing plant, has not been done. Right. And our view is very simple. If you don't understand the consequences of what you already have, how can you grant permission to significantly ratchet up the risk?
Now, Claire, I just wanted to put something to you here because this is very, very important information that we have here. CRH has breached its licence for dust emissions in April 2017 specifically, yet denied responsibility until people like yourselves just went out and protested. What happened?
Okay, the first incident took place with, I'll just give you a quick
yes,
run on it, John, 2015, and that occurred, that was Saturday morning, I remember it quite well. Opened my front door and I have a black hatchback car which was completely covered in dust. It was like you couldn't, like I was like, what is after happening? It was like a sandstorm.
Yeah.
And it just following some research, we found out that there was a malfunction in the plant. And as a result, quite a number of houses within 3 or 4 kilometres and cars and property, people's property were covered as a result of that malfunction. So they apologised for that, came around, offered free car washes, said it would never again happen, and got on with it. And then there was a couple of other minor incidents that took place, but last year was quite significant again, April and May of last year. There was more dust again on our cars, windows, houses, and we reported them to the EPA and on Irish Cement, and Irish Cement actually denied any responsibility for any sort of incident at the plant. So as a result, I myself had to go away and get the sample tested from my car to prove, in fact, that it did come from their plant, and the EPA had to basically agree with the sample that I had taken to say yes, it actually is from Irish Cement. So it was only then, when the EPA got involved, that they admitted liability. So it's the likes of myself and other people in this housing estate and close ones in the Raheen, Dordogne and Mungret area, we're the ones that are policing them. We're the ones that are basically doing the EPA's job, because they're self-monitoring, they're self-regulating. There is no monitoring station here. They are like the first ones to deny any sort of responsibility when a dust blowout or a malfunction occurs.
They didn't expect you to rise up.
No, they didn't. And we're at a stage now where it's nearly a full-time job. We're keeping monitoring them.
But you shouldn't have to do that, because you see, you're the taxpayer, you're the resident. You bought your home in good faith, like all the other great people here in Sleenamala. And surely with God, between the Limerick City County Council and the EPA and local councillors can I say, councillors, not TDs, councillors who are elected by the people, who sit on the council, have the responsibility to safeguard you.
Absolutely.
But as far as I can see, none of this has been done.
They are all aware. Everybody's aware. The council
What
is
are they
aware. The
doing?
councillors are aware. The HSE are aware. The EPA are aware. Everybody is aware of what's going on, but nothing is happening. Which is why we're campaigning now to get a full-time monitoring station
I think it's
put back in
essential
Limerick.
for West Limerick,
Oh,
for
it
the
is.
N69
It is.
estuary. I think it's very, very
Yeah.
important. Angus, I just want to come to you because you have a very interesting story as well about a cluster. Just talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, I remember last year giving a talk in a community centre not far from here, and at the end of the talk, a woman stood up and she was quite emotional, and she said, "Gosh, what you have said has brought so much into focus for me, because I had no idea as to how polluting Irish cement have been over the years." And she then started to talk about her family history and her grandfather, who had a family of 11 children, and they lived in Mungret. And because there were so many children and they were relatively poor, they were self-sufficient, more or less. They grew their own vegetables, they had hens, pigs, a cow, and so forth. And on the surface, they were a very healthy family. But then in her aunts and uncles, in their late 30s and early 40s, began to die before their time. And she talked about how, I think it was nearly 8 of the 11 siblings died very young.
And you made a very important point earlier on, Angus, that these people were self-sufficient.
Yeah.
They ate healthy, they grew their own food, and yet this happened.
Exactly.
90% of the 11 siblings were gone.
Yeah, and again, this is where one has to really wonder as to whether the right type of data has been both gathered and properly analysed and processed, because there clearly is something of a crisis, a health crisis in this area, to do with both cancer levels and pulmonary disease, breathing difficulties. And again, I would reinforce that point that I made before, that 1 in 5 citizens of Limerick City have or use regularly a Ventolin inhaler for asthma or a related breathing disease. And that's a lot of people. So if you're now going to start essentially polluting the air more than it is at the moment, what's it like for those people? What's it like for those asthma sufferers? And I must say, I'm a mild asthma sufferer myself.
Yes.
But I have noticed that my breathing living here in Limerick, which should be actually a pretty good place to live,
Because it's countryside.
there's a lot of countryside,
Yes.
there's not a great deal of traffic, but in fact I do suffer quite badly from asthma on a regular basis. It used to be very much an incidental problem I had, but now I have.
Now you'll see the rate of occurrence going up.
Yeah, and Irish Cement have admitted that they already contaminate the air in this region quite a lot with the emissions that come out of their cement works. But again, the science of air quality now is really going into another stratosphere, if
Yes,
you
I
like.
agree.
What we have seen over the last decade or so is the realization and recognition that particulate matter, tiny particles of heavy metals or of just small airborne dust contaminants are beginning to really affect the quality of life of people living in cities in particular. And we know the story of how diesel cars across the world are being taken off city streets because they release so much PM 2.5, as it's called, which is a particularly insidious particulate matter. But where, again, the HSE are failing us is that the science at the moment is sending out very strong red light signals. In other words, we should be very, very aware of what we're doing to the air. We should be particularly aware of what we're doing to the air when large populations of people are going to be breathing in that air.
But that brings me back to the very same point. With what all of you have said there today, the attitude of CRH, the attitude of local politicians, councillors and TDs, the Limerick City and County Council, on board Pleanála, none of them seem to be either willing or able to listen and act on data that science is presenting to them. I mean, are we going to go through, in 20 years' time, that the polar caps will be non-existent, that our water levels will be above land and will be flooded out? This is what is going to happen in the next 20, 25 years, because people are not taking account of the science that's sending us the signals. Change what you're doing. And Derek, you wanted to say something about that as well, on one of the issues there, that they're not listening, they're not picking up on the data.
Absolutely. Let me make a couple of points, John.
Yeah.
The first one related specifically to the data that we talked about. Angus mentioned PM10. PM10 is the most visible and ironically not the highest risk, but the most insidious form of dust. We can feel it in our nostrils. Under pressure from MAP, Limerick City and County introduced a small number of monitors and allowed us access the data. This was done in, I believe, August of last year.
Right.
We have data from November onwards. The data that comes out and that's analysed by the EPA as it's presented by CRH, because obviously they self-regulate and simply present reports, indicates that we're living with an acceptable air quality based on averages. The problem is damned lies and statistics. The averages don't cover the spikes, and the spikes are where we have the health problems. So we took some specific data directly from Limerick City and County Council, specifically on the 3rd of November last year.
Right.
The average for that 24-hour period indicated that the emissions of the largest particles and also the smaller particles that are more toxic were all within WHO guidelines. The guideline for PM10 is maximum exposure of 40 micrograms per cubic meter.
Right.
At 9:45 that morning, against a threshold of 40, the exposure was over 440 for a 15-minute period.
So it was 40 as a bar standard.
11 times the WHO threshold. Now what's interesting is less than a kilometre from the entrance to the kiln, we have 3 brand new schools. We have a 4th school securing funding for construction.
That's right.
We have 3 other schools within line of sight. So St. Nesson's, St. Paul's. We have schools as far away as Laurel Hill and on the North Circular Road.
In other words, they're all in firing line if you
they're all in
get
firing
my
line.
point.
Yeah. Now, imagine a 15-minute period where it happens to be the 15-minute period that the kids are in the playground, or it happens to be the 15 minutes where the kids are being dropped off or going home for lunch.
Yeah.
The average is irrelevant to those kids. It's the 15-minute exposure to 11 times the WHO threshold that becomes an issue. And neither the EPA nor Limerick City and County Council are concerned with the spikes, yet it's the spikes that will cause
That is the
problems.
spikes that are actually causing
Red
problems.
flags. Yeah.
You see, I think the message to people out there, both this will be going out in America, England, all over Ireland, and Europe. I think the most important thing and the message that we can give from these wonderful people here of Limerick Against Pollution group is the fact that people like me and all of us along the western seaboard have to sit down and study every planning application, every mechanical and scientific operation of these type of plants. And if we can't trust the Limerick City and County Council, I'm using that word personally, if we can't trust them, and we can't trust politicians, and we can't trust the EPA, then we have to go the road ourselves and trust ourselves.
That's the second point I'd like to make.
Go, John.
It's not simply the data, it's the fact that we now have a fundamental institutional problem.
Yeah, I
So
agree.
previously, there was a system of checks and balances between institutional process,
Yes.
executive function, and democratic process, and a challenge and response that would be needed for jobs and what we needed for public health and safety, what we needed for the environment. That pendulum seems to have swung completely towards the executive decision-making side.
Yes.
So significant changes were made in the last decade in terms of the role of the executive function within our cities and counties.
Yes.
And as a result, the feedback that we're getting and our experience in this particular process reinforces that local councillors are essentially toothless in all of this process.
That's actually what's worrying me.
They're shadow boxing because it seems to us that the executive had already made their decision on this
Yes.
particular process back at the pre-planning meeting, and everything that happened subsequent to that was a fig leaf. Let's generate documents, let's put them on the web. They were extremely uncooperative in terms of sharing information, information that should be accessible. The country is a signatory to the Aarhus Convention, and under that convention, we as a country have an obligation to engage with the public. Angus talked earlier about the lack of citizen engagement. We don't even have engagement between the executive and councillors. We don't even have engagement between the executive and TDs. We've had, as I mentioned, questions raised in the Dáil, questions raised in the Shannon, where the responding minister has essentially said, well, I'm the Minister for the Environment, but I don't control the EPA. I'm the Minister for Health, but I don't control the HSE.
Because we have immunity.
We
But
have
that was like the Minister for Transport at the time, when bus drivers and workers in the various parts of our transport system went out on strike. And he simply arrogantly said, not my responsibility, I'm not going to come in there with my checkbook. And it was his responsibility. You know, I'm only using that as an example.
So we have this democratic deficit that's an affront to some and a huge boon to others.
Yes.
But ultimately what it means, and I think citizens need to wake up to this, when they look at us in LAP, you know, we don't want to spend our time being our own policemen. But unfortunately the democratic deficit forces us to do it.
Exactly.
We wish we could trust the EPA as enforcers. We wish we could trust the HSE as assessors and guardians of public health. We wish we could trust our elected councillors and TDs to defend us from these institutional
But it
weaknesses.
seems to be now their powers being eroded.
Correct.
Absolutely.
They were taken away. There was a time when they were able to come together as a majority and overturn a decision that was made by the city and county manager, but that has passed, unfortunately, and they've lost any control that they did have once to do that. Even though all of the councillors we have complete cross-party unity. Everybody is completely on our side here with regard to they feel that this decision was absolutely ridiculous and should never have happened. So we have all of the councillors on our side. So you must ask the question, what has gone wrong here? They are represented. We elect them.
That's the point.
To protect us.
Yes.
And-
the EPA are
and
there
what do you
to
do?
protect us.
Exactly.
What's
exactly.
happening?
Yeah, I think
So it's very frustrating.
This is where we have to remember that the former CEO Laura Burke, who previously had been an executive for Indover, the incinerator manufacturer.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
Ran the EPA and went on record in 2005 stating that she didn't feel it was her responsibility to levy fines against companies who were in breach of their license. She saw herself, and she continues to see herself now that she has that role in Brussels as a pan-European executive. She sees her role as encouraging foreign direct investment, encouraging industrial development, helping multinationals, whether they're pharma companies or cement manufacturers or whatever, to understand what it is they need to do to get whatever it is they need done in terms of product and profit while keeping citizens off their backs.
To facilitate them.
Their
Yes,
primary
correct.
role is to keep people like us, civilians with families, thorns in their side, out of the arena.
Well, all I can say is, and Angus, I'm going to come back to you finally there as well. Like, if these people think that the men and women who went out, and children who went out onto the streets about Irish water, paying water rates, if they think for 1 minute that people are going to lie down and see an industrial development 30 miles all the way out the estuary, which will destroy it for generations to come, take note, folks, it ain't going to happen. Council, EPA, you've lost before you've even started, and this is only one battle that I can see the actual sincerity of these great people here. I think what I've taken alarmingly from my meeting here with you today is the fact, which alarms me, 40 is the bar standard, spite 11 times more in this district here, never mind all the other districts out by the estuary. This is absolutely
And we've no
frightening.
explanation.
But you know, one of the early stories in the water charges battle in Limerick was to do with the amount of lead piping, because there was a tremendous amount
Yes.
of water with high levels of lead going into houses. And in fact, we were one of those houses. And I remember getting back, I think this was in about 2013, 14, from being away over the summer, and being concerned about this and getting my water tested to discover that we were drinking water with 10 times the acceptable limit of lead in it. And we weren't the only house on that road. In fact, there were other houses that had a much higher level of lead content. But what was disturbing is that whole road had essentially been replumbed the previous year at great cost and at great inconvenience to both local residents and to motorists entering and leaving the city. And the council knew how much lead there was in those houses. They should then have essentially seen it as their responsibility to have informed the householders and to have actually made those houses safe for drinking water. And they didn't do it.
But you see, that's the point. You've hit a very good, important point. The essential ingredient here is lack of trust, lack of transparency.
But lack of responsibility.
The
The difficulty is that power, the too much political power now, as Derek was saying, plays towards the facilitation of business interests at the cost of citizens. And again, one of the most important moments for me over the last year and a half was when Professor Paul Connett, who is one of the great experts on incineration and its dangers, addressed this here in Limerick last year. And he said that there were essentially three things that an incineration operation and the essential local regional structure of power had to have in place in order for that type of operation to work. The incineration had to be properly regulated, it had to be properly monitored, and if there were problems with it, there had to be genuine enforcement. And when we consider what is happening here, we realise that the regulation is light. That's why industries in many ways come to relocate to Ireland, because there is light regulation. That there has been very, very flimsy monitoring, no collection of data. We've talked about how essentially the HSE have buried their head in the sand over this. And there's no effective enforcement.
No.
I mean, Claire is about to go to court over her complaints over Irish Cement's non-compliance last year. And the hearing will happen in the
6th of July.
in the district court.
Yeah.
And Irish Cement will be fined a few thousand euros, which is laughable.
But you see,
laughable.
This is where the legislators are.
John,
Oh.
my hands are seizing up.
Sorry.
My hands are
His
seizing up.
hands refuse to break. Yeah, but there you go. Actually, so we're in court. I'm a witness for the EPA on the 6th of April, 6th of July. Sorry, they're going to be prosecuted for those denied laws that occurred last year.
Well, that's the start.
Yeah.
That's the catalyst.
Yeah.
Now,
okay, John, you're on.
very good. And Angus, just finally, I want to come to you because just while we were off air, you mentioned a very, very important point there. Just give us a synopsis of what you were saying.
Well, in brief, I think it's very difficult often to see the larger picture. And what I think, and some of my colleagues think, is that we're really being primed to become a sacrificial area here in the Midwest and the Shannon region. And what that actually means is that over the coming years, large amounts of rubbish will be brought into this area and burned. And this is not just in Irish cement, but also the plans to build a gasification plant in Shannon-Golden, the possibilities that other companies dealing with waste, such as Indigo, will also increase their presence in this region. All of this would suggest that actually the plans that we are being exposed to now in terms of Irish Cement's change in their process are part of a much, much larger and longer term plan. And this is something that we wouldn't necessarily be party to, but we will only actually be conscious of essentially when it's too late. And this is very worrying because my discipline is history, so
yes.
I look back and you can see that, really, the future was once the past, and our future in 10, 20 years is going to be the past. But what kind of past will it be? Maybe it will be a past where we will see even higher levels of pulmonary disease, higher levels of cancer, and a community affected even more by big polluting industry.
Well said, Angus. Thank you so much indeed for that. Derek, I'll go to you for the final word, please.
Yeah, I suppose, John, we've talked about some of the risks. There's an upside in all of this. Limerick is talking about radical transformation. We have the Limerick 2030 initiative. We've got major plans to redevelop residences and businesses in the Docklands area. We have new digital industries coming and basing themselves in the city centre. We have huge growth in University of Limerick.
Mm-hmm.
The city is actually putting itself on the map. Unfortunately, we have an executive that seems to believe that you can simultaneously do all of these transformative things and introduce toxic industrial incineration right in the middle of the suburbs.
Mm.
And what the public are saying, I think, is what any sensible person would say, is you can have one or the other, but you cannot have both. And I think what we're talking about here is narrow political expediency that's actually going to jeopardize the strategy that the very same executive has put in place. It's absolutely short-termist. It will be disastrous for the city, but ironically will be disastrous for the executive that's pushing this.
Okay, Derek, thank you indeed. Final word then to Claire.
I'd just like to invite everybody. We're holding a public meeting this coming Friday night, the 27th, in the South Court Hotel at 7:30 p.m. We will be basically discussing our plans for the next phase, which is challenging the EPA application for their emissions licence. And we'd like to invite everybody along who can ask us questions to find out what we've been doing and what our plans are for the next phase of the campaign.
Great. Claire, thank you so much indeed for having us in your
welcome.
home. And it was lovely to be here in this beautiful area, actually, of Sheelmana, and wishing all of the community here the very best of luck in what will be a long-term contest, if you don't mind me saying so, but one where I feel at the end of the day they will succeed, you will succeed. Mm-hmm. Thank you to Derek, great talking to you. Thank you to Angus as well. And thank you to Dennis Wolverhill, who was on camera today. So we hope through today's discussion with these great people represents what actually is happening under our very noses, and where the people and communities of the estuary from Limerick City, Mungret, all the way out down to North Kerry, must take on board what is happening, have that voice, get out and protest, get to your councillors, get to your TDs, and start making your voices heard. Because, like it or not, when we're all dead and gone, it's the next generation that will probably have the pulmonary problems in greater numbers, the cancers, the tumours, and a quality of life that is non-existent. We have got to say, stop right now. So from myself, John Prendergast, a great pleasure being here from What Matters programme. Gurra míle mágat agus slán.